Hello and welcome at the 17th Annual Kościuszko Chair Conference. My name is Filip Styczyński and I am the Director of Operations at the Center for Intermarium Studies at the Institute of World Politics. The theme of this year's conference is Threats and Opportunities in the Intermarium, an update. Today's joint virtual symposium is organized by the Institute of World Politics. For those who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 online MAs, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you are interested in learning more about us, please visit us at iwp.edu. On behalf of IWP, I would like to thank all of our supporters who make IWP events possible. Today we'll be hearing from Michael C. DiCianna. Michael is a candidate for an Executive Master of Arts in National Security Affairs for the Institute of World Politics and a Research Fellow with the Center for Intermarium Studies at IWP. He is also a visiting fellow at the Transatlantic Dialogue Center and a non-resident research assistant at the Yorktown Institute. Focusing his research on military technology, European security affairs, and the Russo-Ukrainian war, Mr. DiCianna has written for the Daily Telegraph Online, National Interest, Providence magazine, Kyiv Post, and Europe's Edge. In July and August 2024, he traveled to Ukraine as a correspondent and charity volunteer. Mr. DiCianna graduated from Duquesne University in 2016 with a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science.
I am a research fellow with the Center for Intermarium Studies at the Institute of World Politics, where I am also an executive master's candidate in the program for national security affairs. And I am also a research assistant at the Yorktown Institute and a visiting fellow at the Transatlantic Dialogue Center in Kyiv. I'm going to be speaking today about some of the research I've done recently, mostly coming out in the form of various editorials and analytical pieces at a number of publications about the trajectory of the war in Ukraine, the Russian war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as we head into the winter of 2024-2025, and of course, tomorrow, today being November 4th, tomorrow we'll see the election of what will be the next administration, either under current Vice President Harris or the return of President Donald Trump to office. And this administration, this presentation is going to be about the outlook as the war as it stands now, entering the winter, and with a nonpartisan focus, what either incoming administration can do to sort of make a course correction and recover the war effort. The main thrust of my argument and the core analytical thrust you see from other experts, both those who are in favor of continued U.S. support for Ukraine and those against it, is that the war has turned both against Ukraine and against the Western alliance in the past 12 months or so, with the first signs of breakage happening both with the failure of the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive to break through significant Russian lines in eastern Ukraine, the 6-month delay in U.S. aid held up in the U.S. House of Representatives that was passed in April, continuation of peace talk efforts pushed by the West that are then ignored by the Russian government. And now, as we're entering the final months of the Biden administration, a recalcitrant Biden administration seemingly uneager and unable to allow Ukraine to use U.S. and other Western supplied weapons to strike deep into Russia. The result has been, for the past year or so, either beginning with the culmination of little gain of the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive, or you could say in January of this year with the sort of renewed Russian offensive effort that's been grinding in eastern Ukraine, that Moscow has the strategic advantage in the war in Ukraine, but not just in Ukraine, but also a strategic advantage in pushing back and trying to whittle away at NATO and in the broader Western coalition of supporting Ukraine, sometimes called the Ramstein Coalition. This presentation will talk about the three ways in which Russia has seized that strategic initiative, and then talk about the way that they can be taken back by Washington, by Brussels, by the EU and NATO, and of course by Kyiv. This will focus as a critique of Western policy towards Ukraine, but I do have some comment I'd like to make about the issues that are sort of Ukrainian-born problems with the war effort, or issues that the Ukrainian government might need to consider and reevaluate. Some other work I've published following my visit to Ukraine this summer touches upon that. I'd like to give a quick thanks to one of my fellow researchers, a woman by the name of D. Arhus, she's a Norwegian journalist. She's currently sort of my research coordinator. She's still in Ukraine and is my eyes and ears on the ground. And she's been a co-author for a number of these publications. My opinions, of course, do not reflect that of IWP, the Center for Intermarium Studies, or any of my other employers or clients. Let's talk about how, in the grand scope of things, how Russia has sort of seized not only the battlefield initiative, but the diplomatic initiative. Regularly, you see now in the news today, talks about from leading political candidates, both Republican and Democrat, as well as foreign policy experts, about what is the future of peace talks in Ukraine. Kyiv is, of course, proposed recently, the Zelensky administration presented was being called the Victory Plan, which involved an increased armaments to Ukraine, Ukrainian membership in NATO, and the restoration of Ukraine's 1991 international borders. The official policy of the Biden administration is, from the war, nominally been in line with this, if not pro-Ukrainian membership. It's been in favor of restoring Ukraine to its 91 borders, but there's been little effort operationally and strategically to push for that objective. And we're starting to see now sort of a public policy shift, sort of guided by U.S. public perception, but more guided by U.S. concerns, both in the administration, outside the administration, of escalation or a quote-unquote forever war. And so you're seeing a significant push by NATO ally members and non-government organizations sort of just bringing up the dialogue of what is the discussion for peace. And this has sort of seeded, in a dangerous way, the diplomatic initiative away from support for Ukraine towards Russia's goal of either freezing the conflict as it is, or in ending Western support for Ukraine, which would leave Ukraine essentially defenseless in future Russian aggression. And a piece that I'm sure we'll link to, I wrote for Providence magazine about titled "Doing Diplomacy for Evil Men." I discussed how the United States has sort of given up its diplomatic initiative, both in Ukraine and also in the ongoing Israel-Hamas war and Israel's war against Iranian proxies, by more vocally in the Israeli context, but also to a degree in the Ukraine context, hoping for, if not outright demanding, ceasefire negotiations to continue. And again, there's a greater, more vocal emphasis on ceasefires in the Middle East conflict, but there's no undercurrents of this in the Ukraine war that fundamentally shows a failure of understanding our adversaries, either in Tehran or in Moscow. The U.S. is not negotiating in good. It does not have partners who are willing to negotiate in good faith. Leaving aside the Ayatollahs for now, Vladimir Putin and his regime have rejected essentially any peace effort that would require serious negotiation with Kyiv. Has not attended any of the Ukrainian organized peace conferences, and from documents leaked as recently as today by, I believe, the Kyiv Independent, show that Russia's peace offer continues to be one that would allow, at the minimum, Russian continued occupation of all of eastern Ukraine, the region known as the Donbass, as well as essentially the complete demilitarization and enforced neutrality of what's left of the Ukrainian state. Russia has yet to budge from these stances, and in fact, as I wrote in my piece and written several other research topics, evaluation of Russian diplomatic messaging and propaganda shows that Russian efforts to seek a peace negotiation have sort of fallen off on the Russian end, because at the moment Russia feels as if it has the battlefield initiative and thus has no interest in further negotiation. It's published by the Trump administration, the Trump administration's potential Trump administration's incoming transition team. That's sort of the Trump administration plan for peace in Ukraine, which would be bringing the Ukrainians to the table by threatening the cutoff of arms supplies, or alluding to the cutoff of arms supplies, and pushing Russia to the table by increasing arms to Ukraine. I've spoken on how this plan is really functionally brilliant in the way of forcing the Russians to negotiate by arming up weapons to Ukraine, but I believe it fails to consider that Russia believes and continues to believe that it will outlast American efforts, and Russia fundamentally sees American negotiation efforts as surrender and conceding. One of the Russian major strategic goals in this conflict, besides the eradication of a Ukrainian state, is also to break apart the Western alliance and show the limits to American staying power in Eastern Europe. That's going to bring me to my next major problem, where the U.S. and its allies, especially in Western Europe, have sort of ceded the initiative to Russia, and that's the continuing debate over allowing Ukraine to strike into Russian territory with U.S. supplied weapons, or to adequately supply Ukrainian fighting forces, either with offensive weapons to regain more ground in occupied Ukraine, or to defend Ukrainian airspace from what will certainly be a winter of vicious attacks by Russian missile and air power against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. So it's important to factors as we give this presentation at the beginning of November. We are heading into what will be first the rainy and cold season, and then the frozen season in Ukraine, where the roads will become increasingly impassable for tracked vehicles and even wheeled vehicles. And you're likely to see in December and January a slowdown of Russian offensive operations, which have admittedly been slow in pace but steadily gaining ground in eastern Ukraine. Fighting is ongoing in the city of Pokrovsk and other Ukrainian cities in Donetsk Oblast and other areas along the Donbass front, as well as slight Russian advances to take back areas seized by Ukraine in Russia's Kursk Oblast. But as the winter sets in and sort of freezes the front lines in a literal sense, you're almost certain to see an increased Russian bombardment of Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian energy infrastructure, especially. This past weekend saw a heavier than normal or heavier than previous barrage of Russian drones and missiles, including against Kyiv. It's important for Western analysts to pay attention to that, because what you'll begin to see, as I've writing about the piece coming out soon for the National Security Journal, pauses for days, maybe even weeks in Russian bombardment that will essentially be the Russians saving of ammo to really pummel Ukrainian targets. So this year, explicitly, with a colder winter than the previous two of the war predicted, a brutal cold winter where the Russians hope to break Ukrainian spirits by cutting off heat and electricity. The area this factors into the failure of the American-led coalition is twofold. One, Ukraine has, since the beginning of the war, and especially since the acquisition of longer-range U.S. weapons, including ATACMS missiles, essentially been begging permission to use these weapons against targets on the Russian side of the border, which is, of course, following any sort of international law on the topic. Ukraine, as the obvious victim of Russian aggression, has the right to respond and strike military targets that are a threat to it within inside Russia's borders. However, the Biden administration has consistently protested this, and also protested against Ukraine using even its own domestic weapon systems, such as Ukrainian-produced drones, to strike Russian targets. There's an ongoing Ukrainian diplomatic effort, sometimes with the phrase, which I can't say in Ukrainian, kill the archer, not the arrow. Ukraine has been begging for authorization and permission to target Russian air bases and Russian missile sites, to destroy Russian strategic bombers, Russian missile sites, missile launchers, and other sorts of weapon systems that Russia can keep safely on its side of the border than firing at Ukraine. There was some movement from the Biden administration earlier this year when the Russian Kharkiv offensive, which threatened temporarily even to push as far as the city of Kharkiv, but is sort of stalled in northeastern Ukraine, or trudging along slowly there. But it also saw a brutal, and it continues to see a brutal bombardment of Kharkiv, mostly using Russian air power, which flies safely on the Russian side of the border outside of range of many Ukrainian air defense systems, striking civilian targets. And I mean, civilian targets here, I do often mean apartment buildings or city governance buildings with glide bombs, essentially, rudimentary enabled dumb munitions that to have better range and better targeting capability. There was some shift allowing the Ukrainians to strike back on Russian military formations just across the border, but the Biden administration continues to limit Ukraine's ability to shoot down Russian air power or target Russian missile systems. The Biden administration logic behind this, beyond the vague repeating fear of escalation, has been being unwilling to let the Ukrainians strike Russia's sort of dual-use weapon systems, basically, especially strategic bombers or missile systems that could carry either conventional or nuclear weapons. The Putin regime has repeatedly said that strikes on those would be a red line. But as I've written for my piece in National Interest, the title of is Russian Caution Should Be a Lesson, which I wrote shortly before beginning my time as a fellowship with IWP, but something I've reiterated on in further writing, is how Putin regularly allows his red lines to be crossed by the Ukrainians and by the US and allies with no response. Unfortunately, the Biden administration seems to have tripled down on its refusal to allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russia, especially targeting these strategic air assets with US-made weapons. However, with the new administration coming in, either a Harris administration or a Trump administration, there is an opening starting in January for either of those administrations to sort of reconsider and walk back those previous restrictions, sort of getting the permission that only comes from all new faces in the building and all new faces in leadership, that will allow Ukraine to punish the Russians for their continued offensive operations as well as their continued bombardment of Ukrainian cities. Another key aspect that we're starting to see some motion on, and again, it seems unlikely to see change during the Biden administration, but hopefully in the next administration, we'll see a effort to sort of get NATO a little more involved tacitly in the war. The U.S. Congress's Helsinki Commission, the two chairs of it, wrote a letter to the Biden administration asking to give the Polish government permission to shoot down missiles over Ukraine's airspace. Now, this has been interesting because the Polish government has not explicitly said, the Tusk administration has not said that they are certain to use this authorization. There's been discussions by the Polish foreign minister about shooting down Russian missiles or drones that stray into Polish airspace. But this is a significant change because it's not US politicians demanding Poland take action, but it is suggesting that if Poland decided to take that action, that it would be an effective means of assisting Ukraine's air defenses. I wrote about this in a piece for the Center for European Policy Analysis journal Europe's Edge over the summer, where I commenting on the need to allow such an authorization. I said NATO members should consider expanding their air defense cordons over Ukraine to protect Western Ukraine's critical infrastructure. This would then allow Ukraine to prioritize where it deploys the air defense systems it's been given, or it has natively, using both old Soviet S-300 systems and U.S. supplied Patriot systems. It could then move its air defenses forward, protecting its eastern infrastructure as well as military positions in the east. And NATO forces, staying within NATO, could shoot down Russian missiles and drones, which of course are all unmanned systems and would inflict no Russian casualties, to protect Ukraine's civilian population and civilian infrastructure. The reason I'm glad to see this moving forward, I'm hoping, and there'll be more dialogue from me coming about through this Intermarium Studies, is that besides the diplomatic coup that could take place that's showing a more united NATO and especially a stronger, united eastern flank of NATO. This would be vital for it. It saves Ukraine from having to ask for more air defense systems, which is the U.S. is needing to prioritize where it places them in the Western Pacific or in the Middle East. It would cut down on the expenditure of passing weapon systems to Ukraine, thus being politically savvy as well as tactically operational. Finally, recently, last week, I wrote for SIPA's journal Europe's Edge, a article about following the news that Russia will be deploying North Korean forces in Russia to fight against the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, as well as possibly sending North Korean forces into Ukraine. When I wrote this originally, the U.S. had confirmed only that 3,000 to 6,000 North Korean forces were being sent in training in Russia. The Ukrainian government at the time had set the number at 10,000, the South Korean government somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. The U.S. Department of Defense then since has confirmed that the number is in fact 10,000 North Korean soldiers have been sent to Russia. Open source reporting seems to suggest that they're being given Russian passports and will be deploying as if they are from a Russian oblast out in Siberia to get around the stickiness that, of course, North Korea is not officially a belligerent in this war. Though the Ukrainian government has said they will be treating North Korea as a belligerent in this war. And Ukrainian diplomatic dialogue constantly talks about how Ukraine is effectively fighting against three states, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Two of those states, I would point out, nuclear armed states against the denuclearized Ukrainian state. This represents the sort of third, and if not final, I think the third most drastic failure of the U.S. to maintain the escalation ladder. While the U.S. has set strict rules about not allowing either DoD personnel or DoD contractors to operate in Ukraine, even in Western Ukraine, which has not been attacked by Russian missiles in any significant capacity and isn't really in range of Russian artillery or other Russian firepower. The Russians not only are hardening their forces and training their men in the trials of combat in eastern Ukraine, they're now encouraging and allowing one of Russia's growingly important allies, North Korea, to send essentially a division's worth of men to Ukraine to train in modern combat, to learn the ins and outs of drone warfare, fighting in the trenches in eastern Ukraine, armored combat, all the skills that these North Korean soldiers, if they survive and if they come back in a significant number, which I advocated in my Europe's Edge piece, that the U.S. would, in South Korea and other countries, would be wise to not allow that and should in fact insist the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military, in explicitly targeting these forces. You'll have two members of the growing axis of evil, or the axis of authoritarians, who have more modern warfare, modern 21st century industrial warfare training than any member of NATO. Yes, the U.S. military is ending its 20-year engagement in the global war on terror in the Middle East, but primarily those were counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations. Right now, the three most battle-trained ground forces in the world are the Russians, the Ukrainians, and soon the North Koreans. This is not to make light of the success in urban combat the IDF has had against both Hamas and now against Hezbollah, but the nature of war in future conflict will likely more reflect the scale and space of operations we're seeing in eastern Ukraine than in the tight confines of the Gaza Strip, at least outside of urban combat. So the U.S. seemingly so far over the past week allowing, without any response, North Korean forces to join the war against Ukraine. And, as some have said, literally North Korean forces helping to invade Europe is a significant abdication of serious security control and responsibility in Europe and in effect globally. Because, of course, these North Korean forces, after they train and return, will, of course, go back to the Korean Peninsula, and you'll have a more hardened, more experienced North Korean force to threaten South Korea, especially in the event of a crisis over the Taiwan Straits. The U.S. response so far has been no stronger word than tepid. the Biden administration says that there'll be no new restrictions on targeting those North Korean forces, which was widely seen by the Ukrainians I spoke to, Ukrainian experts and Ukrainian military officials, as sort of a joke, as if it would be suggested that the Ukraine would not be allowed to shoot North Korean soldiers that are invading Ukraine. But other than that, there's been not even announced new sanctions or new arms shipments. And as I said, this is the sort of the third and final way, as we enter 2025 and enter a new presidential administration, that NATO collectively is seeming to, if not sign off from supporting Ukraine, showing the limits to which we're willing to support Ukraine. And, as I've written a number of reports, a number of my research through the Center of Intermarium Studies, this showcases a drastic danger to the U.S. position in Europe, to the NATO alliance, to the EU as a future of European centralization and security, but also to U.S. interests abroad, because, of course, the lack of deterrence and the lack of focus and strategic thought we're showing in Ukraine will certainly be observed by our adversaries, not just in Moscow, but also Beijing and in Tehran and in Pyongyang. We are broadcasting, in my opinion, loudly that the U.S. has a limited concern for Europe, a limited concern for our democratic allies and partners, and a drastic lack of creativity. The next administration, either under a President Harris or a second term of President Trump, does have the opportunity, however, to reverse these changes. The Ukrainian war effort, although the initiative is against Ukraine now and in the Russians' hands, is easily fixable. The Zelensky administration has come out in the last week or so complaining about how the fact that Ukraine's only received 10% of the goods promised under the April National Security Supplemental from the United States. It would be wise of the next administration to fix that arms supply and rapidly uptick the pace of supplying weapons to Ukraine. It would be also behoove them to remove the restrictions on targeting Russian military assets on the Russian side of the border, as well as just wider diplomatic measures in reminding the world and reminding the Russians, as well as reminding the Chinese and the North Koreans, that the U.S. and NATO is in this to win this. It would reassure the Ukrainians. It would reassure our NATO allies on the Eastern Front. It would send a signal to both the Chinese Communist Party and to the people of Taiwan that the U.S. does not put a 3-year time limit on how long we support allies when they're facing violent, unprovoked, murderous aggression. As I said, January will be a chance for these sort of reset policies in Europe and globally. Either way, as I said, we'll have either, whether it's Democrat or Republican, a new president sitting behind the Resolute desk, and it's a chance to show what the Resolute desk means on the global stage. If the U.S. does not take that initiative, it's likely to see this war in Ukraine continue to grind on. There's little chance for meaningful peace talks, at least not peace talks that drastically favor the Russians and leave Ukraine and thus in Eastern Europe in a more dangerous space than where we're leaving it now. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. I have more upcoming pieces about the risks of prematurely, if you will, ending the war in Ukraine in a way that's disadvantageous to either Kyiv or Eastern allies, as well as to our own defense industrial base, as well as some upcoming work about how the U.S. risks ceding its role as the leader of important coalitions such as the NATO coalition, but also non-military agreements such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue in the Indo-Pacific, or in our bilateral relationships such as with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my presentation today and considering how, while the U.S., through a lack of resolution and creativity, has temporarily ceded the advantage to the Russians in Eastern Europe, there are potentials in the coming months to see a reversal of that with both increased material support as well as a new diplomatic stance on the war. Thank you.